you have a negative 20 hertz in frequency, and this is a negative Doppler shift. So if the Doppler shift object is moving towards the receiver, the received frequency is greater than the transmitted frequency. If the negative Doppler shift object is moving away from the receiver, the received frequency is less than the transmitted frequency. It's okay. Thank God I record my fear, but I don't record it. Okay? So, the same idea applies in the same manner when you move in a direction that is more significant than the original or derived from the same concept, and therefore you can accurately determine the direction of the flow. Here, in this context, the same idea applies. If you transmit at a frequency of 5 megahertz, you will receive a frequency of 5 megahertz and an additional 300,000 hertz. Therefore, you have a difference of plus 3,000 hertz, which is known as the Doppler shift for that specific moment, because the direction is towards the transducer. If it is moving away from the transducer, the reflected frequency will be lower, resulting in a difference of minus 3,000 hertz. Because you transmitted at 5 megahertz and received approximately 4,997,000 hertz. This phenomenon is what occurs in Doppler imaging. So I rely on this information to know, first of all, the direction. The second thing is the velocity. Now let's look at the topic of velocity. The speed is related in an equation that connects the topic of velocity together. This equation tells you that the Doppler shift, or the change in frequency that occurred, depends on something called the operating frequency, which is the frequency that I sent from the transducer, denoted as F. Multiply it by velocity. Here the velocity refers to the velocity of the blood flow itself, which is the unknown for me. And what is cosine theta? It is the angle. The angel formed between 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 the angel. The direction of the flow in general aligns with the direction of the beam. I rely on it, or in the process, for me, the angle is very important. You need to know what your proper angle is during the process. It was said that the best angle you should work with is considered the brine, meaning it should be in this way. It means that if you have a data direction and flow, the transducer should be positioned accordingly, so the angle you have here is either 0 or 180. Why do I say 0 or 180? If you are at 0, then in this case, it's as if you are aligning the angle with the direction of the blood flow. If it is moving, then your angle is 0. If it is not, then your angle is in both cases. In this situation, what do? Consider this the best angle, because when you substitute, if you take cos 0 or cos 180, you will find that the value is either 1 or minus 1. So what does it mean when the value is 1 or minus 1? It means that in this case, when we go back to our equation, I will find that, as I said, here is cos. If this value is 1, it means that all this value will remain as it is. It will not affect you. And minus 1 means that all this value will also not affect you. Now let's take any other angle. For example, if we take an angle of 30 degrees, 150 degrees, 45 degrees, or 135 degrees, the more you increase the angle, the more the value of the Doppler shift will decrease. So what does it mean for it to decrease? It means the value of the Doppler shift. As for the equation we were working on, if you want to detect a shift that has occurred in the frequency, the more you are able to detect that there is a shift in the frequency you transmitted and the one you received, the better you can. detect the direction and velocity accurately. Because if we assume you sent an ultrasound pulse and received it, and the shift in frequency was very weak and you couldn't detect it, what does that mean? It means that in this case, your accuracy in detecting your direction will be weak. This is related to these factors. First, the frequency. If the angle increases, it will affect your measurements. As the angle increases, you will find that the value at the point is 0.08, which can be considered as 1. This means that this value remains the same. However, when we increase the angle, we find that the value becomes 0.87. What does it mean? It means that this value will decrease, because if you multiply 0.5, for example, by this value, if this value is 10, multiplying it by 0.5 gives you 5, so you have made a reduction. But if you multiply it by 1, it gives you 10. For example, multiplied by 1 gives you 10. So in this case, the original value of the Doppler shift will not decrease at all if you choose an angle parallel, or your maximum threshold is 60 degrees. This 60 degrees is considered the threshold for the angle of your transducer on the blood flow of your U vessels. All right. Now let's go back to the topic of speed. This speed is related to the blood flow, so you can simply conclude from these equations. You have the angle and you have the speed, and the ultrasound speed is plus in the medium 1540. You have the speed and you have the speed and you have the speed and you have the speed. Well, we all agree that it is the coldest and yours. So simply put, you can easily and accurately obtain the speed of the blood flow that is present in your vessel. Okay, so this is the equation that represents what happened for you. It relies heavily on what is available. All right. Here, as we said, 45 and 60 are 3 degrees on one side, while on the other side, they are 150, 135, and 120, so you don't get confused. It's nice how you say 3 degrees 60 according to the direction of the blood flow. If we say we are talking about the direction of the blood flow with the transducer, or in the direction of the transducer, then you are talking about 30, 45, and 60. But if it's the opposite, then you are talking about the corresponding angles on the other side, 150, 135, and 120. Of course, 90 degrees. If you substitute with the cosine of 90, you will find it equals 0. What does 0 mean? It means you will multiply all the previous terms by 0, which means you won't be able to detect any information about the Doppler shift, right? And so you are not detecting any information about the velocity or the speed of the blood flow. That's the idea of the bubble. That's the idea of the bubble. If I give you a spectrum like this spectrum represents the movement of the subject that is moving, or something that is moving. It starts to come if it is in or in. You should be in, you should be with, or the amplitude increases or decreases depending on, of course, or based on the need that is moving. If it gives you high intensity or low intensity, okay, come here. What are we talking about? Okay, so far so good. Is there any issue or problem? Okay, good. Of course, these are the same equations and the same discussion. This is cosine 90 and this is cosine 0. Now, if we substitute in the equation, cosine 90 is 0, while cosine 0 is 1, which is the maximum Doppler shift for you. So the Doppler We are now talking about Doppler. There is a need called continuous wave Doppler and pulsed wave Doppler. If we think that we have something called continuous wave Doppler, then we also have pulsed wave Doppler. If we remember that I mentioned a case related to continuous wave Doppler, I said that if I have something and I want to detect the motion of an object moving at a very high speed, in the case of pulsed wave Doppler, what do? If you say that I will send pulses, meaning I will send a pulse and wait to receive it, then in this case, the speed of that object could be faster than sending the pulse and receiving it. Remember the topic of sampling rate and aliasing artifact. I was saying that if you have a sampling frequency, it must be faster than the maximum frequency of the object itself. If something is moving very fast, the frequency must be faster than the maximum frequency of that object. For example, when I was talking about the fan, if I have a fan and its speed increases, you can't detect the blades of the fan itself. You can't see the edges of the fan because they are moving too fast. Your eye's speed and detection speed become lower, so the frequency your eye captures is less than the frequency of the fan's movement itself. The same idea applies if you have something, for instance, in cardiac imaging, where there is fast movement. The heart waves that occur need a technique that is fast enough to detect that motion without creating an aliasing artifact. As we mentioned before, there is data that can be mixed or lost in the reception. So how do you work on this? You use continuous wave Doppler. Continuous wave Doppler means you are using a transducer, and this transducer gives you... What does continuous wave mean? Remember the topic of dumping. I was saying that if I want a high frequency short pulse, I perform dumping or heavy dumping to stop my pulse, which gives me a short pulse. So in this case, you are creating a short pulse lens. So that's short. In your hands, but if you want to use your own device, it should be continuous. In this case, you don't want the existing one. You have your own large device, so your Q factor is large. Your device will be small. Remember the equation we talked about, which is the center frequency over the bandwidth you have. For you, this means you are providing 100% continuous wave. You will use two crystals, one for transmission and one for receiving the wave to produce the continuous wave Doppler for you. This is regarding continuous wave. So, what about the continuous wave Doppler? The continuous wave transducer, as we mentioned, uses two crystals, one for transmission and the other for receiving. The idea is that you are detecting the high velocities present. However, there is a problem. When you try to detect in this manner, you have one crystal sending a signal and the other crystal receiving it in a specific area where interference occurs between the incoming signals or the arterial home pulses coming in. The issues related to the imaging process in the continuous context, when you are working for yourself, some problems related to the process occur, but when you have a specific sample volume and say, I want to measure the velocity here, or measure a certain character or property, some problems may start to occur. Yes, you begin to detect very high velocity, but in some problems that occur, you find that you cannot precisely determine where exactly this signal is coming from. This is one of the existing issues. You even have the topic of time gain compensation that we talked about. And I mentioned that when the signal comes to you, for example, from higher depths, you start to compensate for the pulses due to the attenuation that has occurred. You cannot do this, as I said, because there is a region where interference occurs due to having one that is receiving and the other undergoing a process. So this affects what you have. It's easy for me to use. It really manages the flow that is happening, of course, but he can't measure the velocity that is present. Okay, all right. When we talk about it, you are sending and then...
Peace be upon you and God's mercy and blessings.
All right. To measure the tadaffuq, what do you really need? Okay. So what exactly will it work on? It will work on what it receives. All right. It can detect whether there is flow or not. Is this the area where the interference happened? I'll give you another picture. So, is this the area where the interference occurred? Have you seen this image, doctor? All right, what do you have here? When you come, here in Al-Mawja Al-Mustamirra, it starts with you when you create a certain line. When you come to create a certain line, this strip indicates that you should follow the existing movement or the problem present or this existing movement. Well, the control process regarding velocity depends on what? It depends on your estimation of the signal that comes to you. Well, the control process happening here is that you are working on a specific filter or working if you have two filters like this. In the continuous wave, you cannot precisely determine the transmission or the signal coming to you from any person or source. Are you with me? In this case, when you measure the flow, you are measuring any 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 flow.
There is an idea that we will use continuous sweep Docker, and 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 we will use continuous sweep Docker. The idea is that in Echo, we utilize two computers, and I call it Doppler. We need to work generally like what we do in Echo. We measure velocities, but we don't work with Doppler. We don't know what it means. We don't work with it urgently to measure velocities like that, because the difference in velocity appears if there is estenos or many other conditions.
If I use the Al-Mawja Al-Mustamirra, for example, are any of you currently working with Echo? The continuous Doppler is what is used with handheld Doppler, meaning that when we hear about it in emergencies, or when the specialist uses the handheld Doppler, they just listen to the sound of the hand, and it doesn't give them an estimation of the velocity. It only indicates whether there is flow or not. So, it means that it estimates whether there is flow or not. It just lets us know that there is flow, for example, in the...
They just tell us that there's this law, but they don't provide any details. We rarely use it, or we don't use it at all. It's used for children to hear and see if there's something or not. That's what I understood, and if I didn't get it right, that's fine. Okay, I have color here in pulsed wave. I have color, power, and spectral. I told you earlier that I determine the direction. This direction is the direction of the plot flow. Is this direction towards the transducer or away from the transducer? So I have the color Doppler, Mr. Youssef, and the transducer symbol. So I have that settled. It encodes the movement of blood in a way that uses particular and distinct colors. This color can change, meaning it is not fixed. Typically speaking, red indicates flow towards the transducer, which appears as a boost in flow, for example, in the portal area. If the flow is in the direction of the transducer, it is red. Conversely, if it is blue, it indicates flow away from the transducer, showing a negative shift or negative velocity. This is related to color, Doppler imaging, and it appears in this manner in general. Here, the same concept applies. The blue indicates flow away from the transducer, and the red indicates flow towards the transducer. This is the shape for flow towards the transducer, and regarding my RBCs, red blood cells. If they are stationary or moving towards the transducer, the reflected frequency will increase. If they are moving away from the transducer, the reflected frequency will decrease. So the frequency away from the transducer is the L reflected frequency. Here, if you have your house or your belongings or possessions ready, your image will appear like this. In this case, you can't see the image as if it has something appearing between what is present, so you are not able to perceive it in the correct manner or understand what is there. For example, such as you might find it challenging. Here, of course, with the change in the angle of the Doppler beam, the blood flow direction towards the transducer appears in red, which means it is in positive velocity or positive Doppler shift, and this is shown in this way. Now, if the Doppler beam and the blood flow are away from the transducer, it appears in blue like this. Of course, your angle of incidence here is less than 90 degrees. There is something called color flow mapping. Here we were saying that we have identified the direction, which is important in medical imaging. Additionally, you need to know that there are areas with flow or higher flow of red blood cells, RBCs, and areas with less flow of RBCs. This means that in certain places, such as these regions where there is high plot flow, this high blood circulation corresponds to an increased number of RBCs. When the reflected intensity of the ultrasound increases significantly in these specific areas, it starts encoding and integrating the incoming signal onto the image itself. We can see a very high intensity level present within these particular zones, and it begins to include and incorporate the signal it receives onto the image display using different colors. For example, if you are talking about movement, you are discussing something beautiful indeed. It has been said that it gets divided into degrees, and each one represents what has been received. For example, in this way, you will find areas that are more bright and areas that are less bright. The areas that are more bright indicate that the RBCs have high blood flow, while the areas that are less bright indicate that the blood flow is low. This relies heavily on what I call the power Doppler mode, which I also refer to as angio. It depends on detecting the distribution of the RBCs present in your imaging. So, what is the distribution in your imaging? The quantity that is currently available will provide you with the exact amount that is present in your item, ensuring that you have a clear understanding of what is included and available for use. So now you have information about the direction, and at the same time, you can obtain information about the intensity of blood flow. In the topic of detection, power Doppler is considered superior, and high power Doppler means that the transducer has a higher power than the conventional Doppler. It has a higher power than conventional Doppler. Yes, there is a problem with the results in that it starts to show, for example, here is the shape of the power Doppler. This color that is present in certain shades means that in this area, here and here, it indicates that there is either red, which tells you that there is a direction, whether it is upward or here. In this area, there is a flash artifact, and this is referred to as a flash artifact. Here, it indicates that the sensitivity of power Doppler is high, which means that if there is any flow, even very minimal, to the blood supply or to the tissues themselves around the area of the vessels, it will detect it and give you the existing flash artifact due to its high sensitivity. This is another form of color Doppler, and here is the power Doppler. Now that I know my direction, I want to see the velocity of the plot flow. There is something called a jet, which means you specify a certain location or area within the vessel and tell it that you want to see the speed or the shape of the spectrum in that area. For example, you will find the shape of the spectrum, which indicates the amount of change in reflection intensity in that region. You define a specific field of view and a certain area in a particular vessel, and it starts to give you results. For instance, you will find that all the peaks are in the area of the post because of this. Then, for example, you will find all the peaks here because it starts to show you the existing peaks afterward. It starts to derive what some call the peak velocity, or the parameter from which it begins to calculate the velocity of the blood flow. Here, the same applies to the portal vein. Here is the spectrum shape, and this is the flow coming from the transducer. Okay, there are some parameters called the resistive index and the pulsatile index. What is this about? You have two types of vessels present.